Have you ever read the book of Ezekiel? This is one wild and wonderful ride of a book. It opens right away with Ezekiel standing in the desert outside the city of Babylon, and he sees this incredible storm cloud coming down across the desert, barreling down on him as blazing fire and lightning. And then it continues that way all the way up to chapter 37, where we find ourselves today, with Ezekiel's vision of the valley of the dry bones. But by the same token, it has a very provocative and powerful message for us today. So let's take a look at Ezekiel chapter 37. But first, we need coffee. Good morning and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name's David Paris. So if you like this channel, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below. If you like the material, give it a thumbs up or make a comment down below. Now a little bit of background on Ezekiel. Ezekiel lives somewhere between 600 BC to, let's say, 570 to 550 BC. In 722 BC, the northern 10 tribes of Israel have been conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and they've been carried off as captives, never to be heard from again. In the south, you have Judah and the city of Jerusalem left behind. Now, unfortunately, Judah is situated between the major superpower to the north and Egypt to the south. Now, Assyria has been replaced by the Babylonian Empire, and during Ezekiel's lifetime, Babylon is at war with Egypt. And unfortunately, Judah lies directly between the two. In 596 BC, Judah is conquered by Babylon because they've given their allegiance to Egypt. Judah is conquered, and the people are taken off as captives into Babylon. Now what this means is their nation is destroyed. Their cities are burned and pulled down. Jerusalem itself is destroyed, and the temple is not only pulled down, but it's sacked. Its treasures are taken off. The Ark of the Temple, which is so important within Judaism, is taken off into captivity, never to be heard from or never to be seen again. Its people have been killed, or those who were left alive have been taken off as slaves into Babylon. It no longer has a priesthood, a temple, a city, a nation. For all intents and purposes, the Jewish nation is dead. And this is when Ezekiel writes. He is part of the Jewish dispersion in Babylon as slaves, and he is writing to a dispossessed people during this time who really have little to no hope. They were a dead people. In Ezekiel 3:22 through 23, God reveals himself to Ezekiel in a valley. 3:22 reads, "And the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he said to me, Arise, go out into the valley, and there I will speak with you. So I arose and went out into the valley, and behold, the glory of the Lord stood there, and I fell on my face." When we come to Ezekiel chapter 37, we have another vision where God leads Ezekiel out to this broad valley. Only this time, instead of seeing God's glory, Ezekiel is led into a really horrific scene. It's a very dramatic and gruesome vision, perhaps one of the most vivid in all the Bible. When Ezekiel in chapter 37 is led out to this valley, what does he see? He's in the middle of this valley that is just littered with dead, dry bones. It's the bones of people that have been slaughtered. Now, why has this happened, and what is this about? In order to understand this, we need to back up to chapter 36. And in that chapter, God promises his people that he's going to regather them, but he also tells us the reason why he has scattered them among the nations. And 36:22 says that he has scattered them among the nations because they have profaned his name. They have defiled the name of God before the other nations. And so as a result, in chapter 36, verses 22 and 23, God says he has acted this way against Israel because they have defiled his holy name. Now, in the same breath that God issues this judgment against Israel because they have defiled his name, he also gives this promise. In verse 24, he says, I will take you from the nations and will gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. God will regather them. He's going to cleanse them from their sins, and he's going to rebuild and repopulate their cities. And so this is the promise. In chapter 37, Ezekiel gives the Jewish people that are deported to Babylon a message of hope. And he does this in the way of an apocalyptic vision. Now, unfortunately today, the church takes a very schizophrenic approach to apocalyptic texts. On the one hand, you have people who read these and see these as a blueprint for what's going to come in the future. Sort of, well, you know the text I'm talking about. The other view is people who look at it and go, man, I have no idea at all what to do this. And so they ignore it, or when they read it, they kind of squint real hard and pass over it. But apocalypse are important, as we'll see with today's text. So our culture today is very obsessed with apocalyptic type ideas. The whole Terminator series of movies was very much an apocalyptic view of the future. Or perhaps the one that people can understand the best are these zombie movies. The one I like best is the Jane Austen versus the Zombies book that came out a few years ago. I think that's probably the high point of this whole genre. So in this passage, even though God brings Ezekiel out into this valley full of dry bones, and he says prophecy over these bones, that's the only thing Ezekiel's got to do. He's got to speak this word over the bones. But it's God who's going to bring all those bones together. And it's God who's going to put his spirit, the Ruach, back within the people. Now in chapter 37, Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones really takes place in two stages. In verses 3 through 10, you have the vision. And then verses 11 through 14, you have his explanation of what takes place. But in this vision, the first part here, we have this very, very gruesome scene. Verse 3, Ezekiel is brought out into this valley and he's placed in the middle of this valley full of dry bones. And then God tells him to walk about. It's a very progressive action here about what's taking place. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand some of the Middle Eastern and the Jewish background behind this. The idea of leaving a dead body out in the ground to rot, just, for the birds to pick at and the worms and the bugs to come and eat, was an anathema to them. You didn't do this. The only time you would leave a dead body out like that is if you wanted to defile that person and body, or you wanted to defile the land. So for example, when the Philistines wage war and they defeat King Saul, what do? They take his body and they nail it to the walls of Beth-shan. They don't bury it. They strip his body and then they nail it to the wall of Beth-shan in 1 Samuel 31, 8 through 10. Now, why do they do this? Well, they wanted to defile the Israeli king. They wanted to defile that city of Beth-shan because now you have this body, this corpse riding on the outside. And this is why the men who go and take that body down off the cross are so highly praised in the Old Testament. So when Ezekiel finds himself in this valley that's full of dry bones, what is that about? What's taking place here? Well, the only time you would get a valley so full of corpses is after a major battle. A foreign army has come in and decimated the people, and then they left the bodies out there not only to defile that nation, but also to defile that country if they didn't want people to inhabit or dwell there any longer. The other thing is, all of those bones and bodies that are there, that's uncleanliness. So for God to put Ezekiel in the middle of this and then tell him to go walking around, not only is he in the middle of defiled bodies that have been left out in the open to rot, not only is he in the middle of a valley that's defiled because of these bodies, but he is being defiled himself as he's walking around. So God takes Ezekiel, plops him down in the middle of this very gruesome and horrific scene. And then he asks him, he says, Ezekiel, can these bones live again? Now Ezekiel, he's going to play a very diplomatic answer here. He realizes that dead bones don't come back to life, but he also realizes that God just took and placed him in the middle of this. And so what does he say? He defers. Oh God, only you know. He commands them to prophecy over them. And you can just imagine the sound of all these bones rattling in this valley as they begin to move and come together, and sinew and joints and tendons and organs and skin begin to grow over them. But they're not alive yet. A second thing has to come. God's Spirit needs to come into these bodies for them to become alive. Now, before I get myself into any trouble, I'm going to call an expert. Someone who I know will talk about Ezekiel at any time because they've been studying it for the past 5 years as they've been working on their PhD dissertation at the Nazarene Study Center at the University of Manchester in England. Yeah, Lindy. Listen, can I talk to you on the computer and ask you some questions about Ezekiel? Okay, I'll be right over.
Hey Dave, how are you?
Great, Lindy. How are you doing?
Doing all right. Done with school. Almost done with school.
How much longer you got?
Probably 6 weeks or so, and then the Bible will be about 2 weeks after that.
And you've been working on your PhD studying Ezekiel for how long now?
Officially, 5.5 years, but about 2 years before that, I started working on crafting a proposal. It's nice to actually have somebody who asks me questions about it who cares.
So, I'm preparing some videos this week on Ezekiel chapter 37, the Valley of the Dry Bones. And I was noticing that there's some echoes and correspondences back to Genesis. And I thought I would call you to see if my ideas are valid or not. And I was wondering what your thoughts are the relationship between Ezekiel 37 and Genesis 2.
So there's this really interesting connection between Genesis 2 and Ezekiel 37. For starters, there's the two-stage process of how something is created and then life is breathed into it. You see that in Genesis 2:7 with what happens with the first human. And then you see it in Ezekiel 37, verse 6, with the dry bones. And actually it's verses like 4 through 8. But you can see it in just one verse in 37:6, where the dry bones are kind of put together and sinews and things are put on them, and then the breath is breathed into them.
So in Genesis 2, if I got this right, Adam is formed out of the dirt, and then God breathes life into him. And
Correct.
Then in Ezekiel, the bones come together, make humans, but they're not alive yet until God breathes into them again, this Ruach, the Spirit of God.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And then when you look at this passage, Ezekiel 37, what would you say like the big punchline of this passage is?
I think the punchline is that God is not defeated, that Yahweh has not been defeated. When nations clash, it's always a clash between deities, right? So in this case, when Babylon comes in and exiles the people, it's a battle between the deity of Marduk of Babylon and Yahweh of Israel. And so the reality of the people being carried off into exile, the destruction of the temple, the loss of everything that they know, what that indicates in the bigger scheme of the ancient Near East is that Yahweh has been defeated. And that because his temple is destroyed and all of the temple accoutrements are carried off with the people as spoils of war, the people themselves become spoils of war. And so the message would appear to be that Yahweh is defeated. And you see that echoed in places in the text itself, like Ezekiel 18:25, tells me that my ways are not right, when in reality it's your ways that aren't right. And I think what he's getting at there is that this is what you would always think, like Yahweh didn't protect us, so we've put our faith in Yahweh, and he's been defeated, and he didn't live up to his end of the bargain. And so you have these themes that run through the book of Ezekiel that I think when you get to this point where Ezekiel is talking with Yahweh, and Yahweh says, can these bones live? And Ezekiel's response is, oh Lord, you know. It's kind of a non-answer. I think
he's put on the spot there, isn't he?
Right? And Ezekiel's like, I don't know. I mean, I'd say no, but this is going somewhere. And that's when Yahweh says, prophesy over these bones. And they're the bones of the defeated. They're the bones of the community. They're the bones of the exile. And what it's highlighting is all of these things that you thought you understood about me that would make sense in the grand scheme of the ancient Near East, I'm flipping on its head and saying, I haven't been defeated. All of this is because your ways are not right. All of this was punishment for your own actions. But I am still victorious, and I am still powerful, and I still have the ability to do what I did in Genesis, which is to create something and to breathe life in it that will go on. So that's what I think the punchline is. Oh, this is big. This isn't just about a spiritual reanimation. Like, this is actually God's way of saying, you thought everything was lost. Everything you knew was gone. You were hopeless. And you blamed me. But in reality, what you think you know about
me,
deities and battles, and me, and your relationship to me, it has been a bit skewed.
How does the message of Ezekiel relate to our context here today? Or a message of hope here or whatever? I think Ezekiel would look at us and say, you're a bunch of pansies. Our nation has been destroyed. Our people have been slaughtered. Our cities have been pulled down. Our temples are destroyed. Our priests are gone. And we're slaves in another country. But then at the same time, I think he would say, look what Yahweh can do.
The current circumstance within the context of a national narrative. And that national narrative from start to finish is all about Yahweh's faithfuless. It's all about the continuing failings of humanity, the continuing set of challenges that we don't generally live up to very well. And yet it always cycles through to highlight Yahweh's faithfulness and to highlight that Yahweh will always be there. And I think that in light of current circumstances, I think the message would be really similar. I mean, I think you can't look at the history of the Hebrew Bible and not think that there are way worse things than this. I think the message for the day is to persevere. I mean, we'll come out of this victorious, but it's not going to be the easiest thing. To be very careful how we intertwine what we think about the world and how we think that God is active in the world. Destruction of the temple, the exile of the people, living as slaves, all of these things, and yet God is still God. And so I think it highlights again that, God is God when he chooses a Davidic king, and God is God when Jerusalem gets destroyed. It kind of cautioned me, I think, to try and be a little bit careful about how I understand who God is based on my circumstances. So if I get sick with the coronavirus, does that mean that God is not who God says he is? If someone that I love and care about dies from this, is that because God isn't who I understand God to be, or is that... So there's a lot of hope there, but it's a challenging kind of hope. And it's actually interesting, as you said that, I was thinking, in a sense, it's the hope that you have from Genesis 2 of creation. In a sense, that hope is what is dead. And so God is recreating a new hope, and he's doing it obviously from the bones of what was before. But in a sense, it's something almost entirely new. Like, the people have a new heart. There's that whole theme in Ezekiel. It's mentioned in Jeremiah too. Here's the story of the Hebrew Bible and how you squandered that. And so in Ezekiel 37, in a sense, it's like, but I can work even through that. And so you've lost this, but I will recreate it.
But yeah, it's still going to take them, 50 years before they leave Babylon? So even though you have this phenomenal promise, it's going to take a long... All the people who are hearing it are going to be dead by the time it's actually fulfilled.
Yeah, God doesn't do things in our time.
Well, be careful and stay healthy.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Dave.
All right. Bye. All right, we're back. I think a couple things come out of the conversation with Lindy that are big points. The first off is that there's a lot of value in doing very extended, deep theological studies. She can answer questions about the book of Ezekiel that I can't. In fact, our little 8-minute interview really was about 40 minutes. I just had to chop out a lot of the stuff that we went on about there. So Ezekiel's prophecy is really an astonishing vision about Israel's ultimate restoration. And more importantly, it's a vision about Israel's spiritual renewal. And the allusions to Genesis chapter 2 in the passage there help reinforce that this first creation that God did in Genesis is now being repeated in a new way in Ezekiel 37. God is going to bring new life to them, and he's going to put a new spirit in them and restore them. And ultimately, it's going to mean the restoration of Israel back to the promised land. But the thing, even though this is an incredibly powerful and hopeful message, it's going to take 70 years from the time of exile until they return. And as I was talking with Lindy, this vision that Ezekiel has is probably around 570 to 560 BC. It's going to be another at least 40 to 50 years before the people go back to the promised land. This does not come about overnight. It requires perseverance, trust, and patience in the God, the creator of the universe, who is working in their lives in a new way. So imagine you're one of the Israelis in the Babylonian captivity. You've lost everything: land, family, friends, priest, temple, cities, and you're now slaves. You've lost your very freedom. You're slaves to these Babylonians. You're a people who have lost no hope. In reality, the nation of Israel is dead. And then Ezekiel comes along and gives this very dramatic vision of the Valley of the Dry Bones. This vision is meant to convey hope to the people in the most dramatic way possible. If God can bring life to these dry bones and put muscle on them, then he can restore the people. He can put new life into them. In the same way, I think it comes across today. No matter how bad your situation is, I think we can say that Israel's is much worse. But God brings this incredible message of hope into the middle of our situations wherever we are. If God can do that with those dry bones, what can he do with us? What is he going to do with us? It's a message that calls us to trust in the God who created in Genesis 2 and then recreated in Ezekiel 37, but is still alive and working today in our lives. And this is a powerful message for us today as well, that God acts and he moves in ways that are mysterious to us, and it may not be according to our timing, but yet he's still there and he's still with us. No matter how fickle or faithless we might be, God remains faithful. Now the first question is, what is an apocalypse? Tough word. Strong coffee. Okay, let's try this again. You gotta love chairs like this.